Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Abrasca and IBRI, for the event. An amazing event with very good panels. I'm really glad to receive here today Karen, head of the Global Investor Relations Advisor for BNY Mellon. She will show us this excellent presentation about global survey about the analysts in investor relations arena. So I think it's a total connection with data science, because in data science, our main point is to collect information from, the people and understand what's happening, what's going on. So in our case at Gerdau, I'm investor relations for Gerdau. I'm proud to announce that today we just launched our data science lab in the investor relations website, probably the first, because I don't know if there's another one globally or in Brazil. And the intention is to connect the investors with the information from Gerdau. In this place, you're gonna find 20 years of capacity information from the Gerdau mills, also information about steel consumption, key indicators from the steel market. So we think data science is really important. That's why we are doing that. And I'm really proud to be here to exchange knowledge with BNY Mellon. I think that's the main reason for this event. I think this Web Summit will come more global, and that's why we are doing English. Because we need to also, receive our foreign IR professionals and community. And just to give you a brief information about science, I was a week ago talking with executive from Itaú, and he's used to be from Itaú, now leader in a startup, telling that he's doing some general meeting app for investor community and also analysts and investor relations professionals. And he was telling me that with this app, he can track the geolocalization where we are voting from. And I was telling him, well, my spreadsheet today, I can show you in Canada where my mill is. Well, your mill is next to my place. And then we check the map localization, and it was exactly the same. That's why I really agree on data. I think data is everything that you can trust today. In a world that we see fake news every day, data, it's what we have more certainty. So with that, I have a surprise for you. We have today here an app that we're gonna, before I call Karen, we're gonna show you a question. So we're gonna show this question through an app called Lido.com. And then you can, with your mobile phone, you're gonna put on the QR code. The QR code will show you open the question. So we're gonna have some seconds to do that. Please feel free to point your mobile phone with the camera to the QR code in the right bottom of your screen. Then you press, that it will appear on the top, the question. So let's take a while to wait and vote. So the question is, who attends meetings with ESG-focused investors? We really think that ESG today, it's the word of the moment. So even in Brazil, we are seeing new events from Itaú, from XP, other banks. So we think this is really important, but let's see what you think. That for me is the best information.
And we can compare it to what we got from the survey.
And it's really interactive. As people are voting, we are seeing the difference between, if it's important or not. It's really amazing. So by now is winning what I think it's really important. You have to connect also the specialists inside the company to talk with the investors. I think, when we talk about governance, investor relations, they know a lot, but when you talk about social, environmental issues, it's really new even for the investor relations officers. So I think this is very important to see more specialists talk with the market. So good. I think it's good. So with that, Karen, thank you for coming. The floor is yours. So you can really, make your presentation with us. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Rodrigo. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry only that we can't all be together in person as we have in the past. I miss Brazil. I miss traveling. I miss seeing everybody's faces. The screen is not the same, but we're going to try, and we're going to use the technology that we have to try to make this as interactive as possible, which I think is fantastic. What IBRI has done is put on a terrific event using all of this new technology. And we're going to talk about data science, as Rodrigo said. So I'll begin the presentation. We'll talk about our IR survey, which is some data science that we do every other year. So can we start the slideshow? Thank you. So if we go to the next page, the methodology, I'll tell you that the Depositary Receipts team at BNY Mellon conducts this survey as a part of the work that we do for our DR clients every other year. We try to gather and use the best information and data on investor relations to inform the advice we give to our clients. We generally use this data and combine it with other sources to help our clients with best practice advice, new ideas in investor relations, and generally helping them to meet their IR goals. This specific survey we conduct every other year, because normally we don't think IR moves or changes that much year to year, and we're trying to capture longer term trends. I think this year is quite different, and it will certainly be interesting to see what has changed when we refilled the survey in 2021. The key thing to note here is when this survey was in the field, when people were asking it, it was answered by IROs in 41 countries, and 335 people took this survey. It was 1 year ago. So well before any of the COVID problems that we've had. And so you have to keep that in mind as we go through this. In Brazil, 35 companies answered our survey. And as we're going through the slides, I'll include some of their answers in my talk. And there's a link to the survey on the IBRI website and also on the BNY Mellon website if you want to take a look at some of this data. I'm currently finding March to be unbelievably a long time ago, but I think as we go through this presentation, we'll find that even though we took this survey a year ago, as we've been analyzing the data over the course of the year, there's so much, it takes us a while. There are still lots of really interesting things we can learn from what we thought about and what IR officers, how they viewed their job, and the lens that they've had, and how that set them up really well to deal with the challenges of today. So let's go to the next slide with our 4 key themes that we found. Every year we see IROs refining their strategy and responding to what they think the future will bring. This year, we weren't so good at predicting the future, but despite that, changes IR team started to make last year and how they responded to those changes in the sell side and other 2019 stresses did help them with the challenges that this year brought. As we started to talk about in the beginning, and you saw that one of my poll questions is about investors driving the global ESG agenda. So investors are not only pushing ESG onto the standing agenda of meetings with issuers, they are bringing their specialists to the table. Issuers are not necessarily, and we looked at the poll question, it looked like of this audience, about 50% of people were bringing their ESG specialists to meetings with investors. That's not the case for the entire world. Respondents reported that while most investors brought an ESG specialist to their meetings, fewer than 1/3 of issuers did. So we think this is an important place where you can really impact how investors see your company and how they view your expertise by having the right experts in the room. We saw heightened concern on the global trade environment when we did this survey. Respondents' concern on the impact of the global trade environment on overall market confidence grew dramatically. From the 2017 survey, 41% thought it was very important or important, and in 2019, it was 73%. That concern was realized, but not in the trade wars, as we thought, but more recently in responses to the pandemic. So it was the right concern, it was just the wrong reasons. And finally, our final theme is the evolving structure of the sell side is impacting investor relations. For almost 2/3 of respondents, the MiFID II regulation of the sell side has either not meant to change or they were uncertain of any change. However, it was a significant minority that reported a negative impact, particularly in Western Europe and North America. And we would note that of every respondent in Western Europe, not a single one reported a positive impact of this legislation, which is a real failure from the point of view of the legislators. If the people that they are regulating think that if nobody thinks that they did a good job, that's a true failure of the legislation, whether or not it's had a huge day-to-day impact or a small day-to-day impact. We do think there was an impact, though, and we think it was how it's been most strongly felt in how nimble companies have been in responding to this new virtual environment. The fact that everybody had to get ready for MiFID II meant that you were ready for the global pandemic. So let's go to the next slide. And the next one. So we're starting with strategy. And this is really just a visual representation of a trend that we all know well. Investor relations is becoming more strategic, more senior, and more listened to at companies around the globe. Investor relations, we all know, IBRI and Abrasca think that it's a strategic management responsibility. And the U.S. National Investor Relations Institute puts it, the role of IR is key in bringing information to the management team to make strategic decisions and choices as it is to bringing company information to the market. It's totally a two-way street. A stronger voice in board meetings, as this slide shows, just proves that the people who you most want to impress, your board of directors, absolutely agree with this. Next slide. Investor relations teams are also doing more work with other groups, not just the board of directors. We see the IR team working more on financial disclosure and reporting, especially in Brazil. So this is quite interesting. In Brazil, 97% of investor relations teams reported they're responsible for financial disclosure and reporting. As you can see from this slide, that is not the case across the board. But we also see investor relations teams doing things like competitive analysis, 45% of Brazilian companies, and also debt investor relations, which was traditionally the domain of the Treasury Department, and where 51% of Brazilian teams have that responsibility. Next slide. Thank you. This year's survey found increasing engagement with passive investors over 2017. We think this increasing communication with passive investors probably also colored the goals that IR teams have. For developed market companies, 59% had a top IR goal of expanding relationships with existing investors. In Brazil, only 20% of companies who answered our survey said they had investor meetings with passive investors over the last 12 months, as compared to 42% of developed markets companies. There is a poll question here if we can put that up. No? Here's the next poll. Here's the poll question. So this is, here we are. In the past 12 months, has your IR team had conversations with investors who have a predominantly passive investment style? This is the question that we asked in the survey. And as I said, it was 20% in our survey of Brazilian companies said that they had meetings with passive investors, which was half of developed market companies. Can we see? Let's let that poll question run, and we'll see if anyone answers it here. What our audience has been doing. And first answer is no. While you're looking at that, I'll let you know that in the U.S., of the companies in the S&P 500, every single one of them has the big three passive investors, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, all three of them in their top 5 shareholders. So that's why they're talking to them. We're talking about what the goals are for the team in terms of meeting with current investors, and also what the team is doing in terms of meeting with passive investors. If all three of those passive investors in your top 5 shareholders, of course you are meeting with them. So expanding relationships with existing investors was only a top goal for 41% of emerging markets companies. And we know that index funds don't weigh nearly as heavily in these shareholder lists. So that's why we think these two things are really tied together. And I see as we've moved in on the polling, it's about 38% of this group that has had those meetings, which is more than what we saw in the overall survey. So you guys are a sample that is more like the developed markets teams and less like the emerging markets teams. And it really very much, we think, depends on who is in your top shareholder base and how much you need to service those investors. You wouldn't go out and reach out to passive investors if they are not part of your shareholder base. That wouldn't make any sense. So I think this is really about the evolution of the shareholder base for investor relations and that expansion of the job in talking about governance and ESG, because you're not really talking about investment highlights with a passive investor. You're talking much more about governance. Should we move to the next slide? So as we were thinking about ESG, because we're tying these two things together, the passive investors and the ESG, I want to look at this chart where the number of companies who held ESG-focused investor meetings was greater in developed markets overall at 52% versus 34% in Brazil. And Brazil matched emerging markets globally there. I would say this is surprising to me because I find emerging markets companies and Brazilian companies in particular to be much more focused on ESG than their developed markets counterparts. Perhaps because you don't get the benefit of the doubt from investors and you need to prove your capabilities more regularly, more openly, and in a more straightforward manner. But in reality, this does tie into how we think about this result. It's not that these conversations aren't happening. It's that we think that these ESG conversations are becoming much more a part of the mainstream investor meeting and not a separate ESG meeting. So this ties in well to our thesis on this finding. If you say that there are less Brazilian companies having specific ESG meetings, it's really because you're talking about ESG all the time and not just as a separate meeting. On a separate note, we also found that developed and emerging markets ESG teams spend their investor relations time differently from developed market teams. Developed markets teams spend 64% of their time that they devote to IR in speaking with existing institutional investors. Emerging markets CSR teams devoted only 42% of their investor relations time to existing investors. And the difference was increased time with prospective institutional investors, so going out and talking to possible new investors, talking to the sell-side analysts, talking to retail investors, and the financial media. So it seems to be a broader role of using the CSR team in a more holistic way in emerging markets and in developed markets, which I think we would suggest is the right way to go about this, is to bring the specialists to as much of the meetings as you can. Let's move on to the next slide, which we're talking about. Our first poll question. that we did at the beginning. The question was, who is attending ESG meetings? So investors bring a specialist to these meetings 83% of the time, according to our respondents. And for issuers, that number is only 27% for global teams, 26% for emerging markets teams. This is a place where Brazil, as I mentioned, really outperforms, and it's so important. If investors are bringing specialists and you're bringing generalists, you are outmatched in that meeting. Particularly if these meetings are taking place virtually, as they are these days, bring the expert. Brazilian companies reported they did bring the expert a solid 50% of the time, well outperforming emerging market companies. So this was our poll question, and if I recall correctly, it was about 50% of the companies on this call said that they brought their ESG expert to ESG-focused meetings. So you guys match our Brazilian sample. The reason we're focused on this conversation and who's at the table in this chart is because the conversation really matters. And I'm going to give you an example of a Brazilian company who I will not name. But Nordea Asset Management just announced recently that they're divesting from a Brazilian company and taking out $50 million in their investment. It wasn't in response to any one single news item or one single action from the company. They said it was, quote, after a period of engagement with the company, we didn't feel we were seeing the response we were looking for. So that was from their head of responsible investments. So we think the conversation really matters, and who's having the conversation matters, because those are the decision makers. The company's response was that it wasn't given the opportunity to demonstrate to Nordea its total commitment to the transparency of its relationships and to the sustainability of its operations. It's a great answer, but to me, that only emphasizes the lesson we think that everyone should take away from this. It's important to have the right people in the room, and it's important to have the right people in the room from the beginning, in all of these meetings, continually. You guys Brazil is doing really well at this. And this example just shows how important it really is and how it continues to be and why it's important that you guys are doing a good job at it. So let's go on to the next slide. IR departments are monitoring their ESG ratings more every year too, although they don't necessarily agree with them. The dissatisfaction with ratings is pretty equal across the board. Globally, only 12% of companies said they thought that their ESG ratings were accurate. It's the same in developed and emerging markets. Brazilians are even pickier, or the ratings are worse. I don't know what the answer is. Only 3% of Brazilian companies who answered our survey agreed that their ESG ratings were accurate. I think that also shows how important engagement is in making sure that you're having that conversation with the rating agencies so that they understand your point of view. Emerging markets companies were more likely to engage with proxy agencies like ISS and Glass Lewis. 54% of them said they spoke with these firms over the past 12 months. And Brazilians lag here, with only 37% reporting they were in contact with the proxy company. So again, it's so important to have this conversation. Rodrigo, do you speak with the proxy firms like ISS or ESG firms like MSCI?
Yes, in fact, we do, but pretty new. We've been doing in the last few years, 2 or 3 years, because we think it's really important. And that was good news because they are improving our rating. So we received the advice from other investor relations officers that a good talk with them could improve our rating. And that was really happened with us to help us on the proxy for AGMs. Yes.
We absolutely agree. It's so important to have that conversation. They can't understand your position if you don't talk to them. So thanks.
Correct. And also they help us improve the disclosure. So we really improved our disclosure because they gave some advice, some information that could be useful for the investors, and they could provide the reports. So that's what we did. We really, increased information disclosure in our integrated report.
Excellent. Should we go back to the slides? Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So we've conducted other surveys in the past, And generally, we find that governance issues resonate most strongly with investors. You guys might remember one we presented in Brazil a few years ago on materiality of non-financial information. And that survey found that investors were most concerned with governance issues. And tone from the top is, can be said to drive all aspects of performance, not just sustainability issues, but also in financial performance. This year's survey was no different. We asked issuers what questions they saw increasing from their investors. And we see from this heat map that governance dominates. So all of at the top of this, the red, these are governance type questions, and across the sectors, it was governance issues that dominated. Diversity and inclusion was also very strong, and that predates all of the protests and elsewhere with the Black Lives Matters movement. So this means that IROs were actually ahead of the curve in dealing with the recent questions that people have been getting on social justice. You guys were used to getting this question from investors. You knew that your companies needed to have an answer to this, and you were prepared. If you look at the chart, the gradations on the heat map at the top go cold at the bottom, and they generally stay similar across all sectors, with a few exceptions that make sense based on the industry. For example, as utilities are more vulnerable to political contributions and corruption, so investors care about that more for utilities. And things like they're sector-based, like financial companies don't get a lot of questions on waste management because it doesn't matter for them. But in general, you can see that investors are asking the right questions. So governance counts for everyone. Tone from the top counts for everyone. And then on a sector-specific basis, investors are not just ticking the box. They're asking questions that make sense on a sector-by-sector basis. So the next slide, please. So I mentioned in the beginning that everyone was focused on global trade concern this year, and I think everybody got it right. It was just for the wrong reasons, but this was a big change from 2017 to 2019, and something that might come back in the 2021 survey. It's something I think we all need to keep an eye on for sure. We also noted on this chart that IR teams continue to look at the US and UK as sources of investment, but it's less than in past years, but they're still the biggest by far, and there really isn't much change since 2017. This is a pretty stable question. And it's still the case that IROs around the globe look to these big markets. And that's why we in the DR business still have jobs. They do it for a good reason. Equity assets under management in the US is $23 trillion US. The UK is $3.4 trillion US, and it's $130 billion for Brazil. So these are still really big sources of long-term capital that you want to tap, and that's why we think that those remain the top sources of increased investment, which is the question we ask. It's where are you looking for increased investment? And people are right to look there. That's where the big dollars are. Next slide, please. So this is a full look of the questions we asked our respondents about for what will impact market confidence in the next year. So we try to keep these the same, some of these the same, survey over survey, so that we can get these long-term trends, but we also try to add things if we see something upcoming. So in the global trade environment, we added that only in 2017. So we had the data for that in 2017 and 2019. If you look at this chart, the one on the bottom is inflation, and I think we need to drop that. Nobody's been concerned about that for 7 years at least from this chart. So I would love to get the opinion of this audience. You can tell us in the chat, or you can ask us in the Q&A afterwards. What do you think we should add to this chart? What is most important for overall market confidence? Not the confidence in your specific company, but overall global market confidence. What should we add to this question set next year? Please keep that in mind and send us an email, send us in the chat, ask us questions in the Q&A. And then we can move on to the next section. The next slide. So this is the final section of the presentation, and this is on the evolving structure of the sell side and investor relations. On this chart, there's no difference between developed markets and emerging markets. 62% of developed market companies saw increased direct outreach from investors, and 60% of Brazilian companies also saw increased direct outreach from investors. And the fact that everybody saw this a year ago means that you were all very well prepared for the kind of outreach that investors are doing now that we're all working from home and from our laptops. And there's much more direct outreach and virtual meetings. Investor relations teams were prepared for this. This was a trend that was well in place before the virus hit. And it was something that investor relations teams were well prepared to deal with. Thinking about MiFID II and looking at this chart, offers to roadshow with the sell side have increased for only 26% of developed market companies, but did increase for 43% of emerging market companies and 49% of Brazilian companies. So the sell side's continuing to do a good job in Brazil. Only 3% of Brazilian companies reported that they were getting less offers to go on roadshows with the sell side. I expect that to continue. They still need to do their job, and you want them to do their job. You want them to be out there selling your company. And I think that makes a difference. The lesser the work that the analysts do for companies with companies in emerging markets, I think can be more valuable to their clients than having yet another call on, for example, I don't know, JP Morgan, or a big US company that the investors know very well. So in a virtual world, it matters less in terms of how you organize this. But one interesting difference between developed and emerging markets use of the sell side is in the logistical management of the roadshows. So the Brazil teams are much more self-sufficient. 54% of developed markets companies told us that they used management of logistics as a criteria for choosing a roadshow partner, but only 23% of Brazilian companies did. You were choosing roadshow partners for I think better reasons. Rodrigo, what do you take into account when you go on the road with the sell side? What's important for you?
Yes, Karen, thank you for the question. Well, I think first of all, for me, a sell-side relationship is much more than a professional relationship. I think it's really a network connection that you build for the years. I have, some sell-sides that I know more than 10 years, and it's really, I would say, something that adds value for the company. Because when you talk with sell-side, you know that it will multiply the information. So they will, have a portfolio of buy-side analysts that they can reach, and sometimes the investor relations we cannot. So I think the most important thing is, giving the same disclosure as you give to the buy side, but I think you have to be more close to the sell side. So the most important thing is, the sell side, they know what's happening, what's going on. Every time that you see a material information, do you think that they will, correctly provide the information for the market, the capital market? So I think it's more than that. You have to see what are the 10. In our case, we have 8 to 10 sell-side analysts that we stay very close, and we know them have let's say a footprint in US, also Europe. So that how we deal with the sell-side connection,
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you bring the CEO or do you bring the business leaders, business managers with you on all your roadshows? I think that's one thing that it also is the advantage of this virtual world we live in. We have the ability to bring more people to meetings than you would in the past. So in the past, emerging markets versus developed markets companies had their CEO for about 11 days on the road versus emerging markets in 5 days. So I think that's something that we can really take advantage of now that we don't actually have to get on the road or go anywhere. Have you been doing that?
Well, we built, I would say, a virtual strategy along the virus, effect, mainly the main point was we focused the CFO to talk with the investors, and we focused the CEO to manage the company. So really, we decided to do that because was a daily focus from the CEO in the company. We sometimes, for the most relevant investors, we gave like 20 minutes from the CEO. But in general terms, we decided to use the vice president, our CFO, to really talk with the investors. Along the first half, we talked with more than 500 investors, institutional investors. Also, we did some, let's say, podcasts and video for the retail investors, which we think is important. But that was a strategy, we know that the alternative to have a video with the CEO is amazing, but all the operations they are in the same view, so they consumed a lot the CEO time at this moment. I think now the second half we're gonna have more time. We saw the CEO doing a lot of videos for ESG. We are really focused on ESG, so our CEO made some webinars with banks for with ESG, so that was really amazing.
I think that's great. We'll have to see what happens in the second half of the year. It makes a lot of sense. You absolutely have to run the company first. So let's go back to the slides. I have one more slide left before we open it up to Q&A. So back to thinking about MiFID II. We did see an increase in a difference in how much time the IRO spends with the sell-side research analyst, which may or may not be related to those changes in how the sell-side is working. But emerging markets investor relations teams spend almost 30% of their time with sell-side analysts as compared to the developed markets teams at about 25%. That 5% difference, that's not that big, but it comes out of time that you're spending with existing institutional investors. So developed markets teams spend 43% of their time with existing institutional investors, and emerging markets spend 10% less, 34%. So I think that's important, and it's interesting to balance that the time spent and where the value is, and making sure that you're serving all of your constituencies are being treated as well as you possibly can, given the time constraints you have to manage and your CEO's time constraints, Rodrigo. So this also impacted MiFID II, we think impacted the goals for investor relations teams. So 30% of emerging markets IROs had expanding the research coverage as a top goal. And that's twice the rate of the developed market peers. So I think these things all go together, how much time you're spending with the sell side and whether or not that's a goal for you in terms of expanding the research coverage. So there's subtle differences and subtle changes for MiFID II. And I think it's going to take time for them to be fully realized. And I know that there hasn't been an enormous difference in Brazil in terms of the treatment of the sell side and the offers to go on the roadshow. But I think there is this subtle impact in how people are thinking about research. And I'm going to give an example from an upcoming survey that we're doing. So we're working with Greenwich Associates right now, who works with the buy side and talks to them about their research budgets. And we asked a question in a survey that's going to come out in later in this year. And we asked them, are you adding any additional vendors into your work with the sell side? And the investors in the US said, oh yes, I've started to add this broker and this broker and this broker as additional vendors. Well, I don't think the sell-side research analysts think of themselves as vendors, but it appears that the investors do. So it's a subtle difference is the changes that is happening when you put a price on something and it's clear that that is what you are selling, then you become a vendor. And I think that that's an interesting but subtle difference that's happening with changes in the sell side. So I think this is interesting. So as I mentioned, this is the last slide of my presentation. And I wanted to just take a second and look back at the changes we thought were going to impact this year. We thought it was going to be MiFID II, the global trade environment, ESG growth, and a greater strategic focus. And then think about what actually has impacted it. Honestly, it's the same. ESG only grows in importance. The global trade environment has been a problem as well, and that's in part due to the pandemic. The change in how we deal with the sell side and how IR teams manage their time due to MiFID II has been completely impacted by the pandemic and has prepared us to deal with the pandemic. And the ability to reach out to investors ourselves and to speak and not to use the sell side just for targeting. Again, we were prepared by MiFID to do that ourselves. So despite the huge changes that have taken place this year, IR teams were ready. And we're already prepared. What do you think, Rodrigo? Do you have any questions?
I have a question from the people. Thank you, Laura Maia. Thank you, Dennis, Roman. The question I will combine, in fact, is about ESG. They want to know, first, if, do you think the fact of the ratings in some, platforms about ESG, it's 0 for some companies, it can affect the valuation of the company? And the second question is, do you think the ESG focus in the sell side arena, it's much more on the foreign sell side than in Brazilian? And that could be a good question for the next survey of BNY Mellon for next year. If they, where is the sell side focus? If the foreign sell side is focusing more in ESG than the Brazilian sell side analysts.
I think I'm going to take the second question first. I think that the sell side in the US and Europe is focusing more on ESG because that's what their clients are focused on. So the biggest clients of the sell side are the major institutional investors like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, but also like Fidelity and Lazard and Norges. They're the ones who are the largest clients of the sell side, and they are very focused on ESG. They have teams dedicated to it. They are using a number of different services to analyze ESG, not just MSCI and Sustainalytics, but also companies like Vigeo Eiris. They look at ISS. They look at Glass Lewis. So I think, and they look at these reports holistically. And so that's, I think, why the international sell side is focused on it, because their clients are. And I'll lead into answering then your first question. I don't think that, in general, companies are using ESG in some cases, they're using it as a screener tool, where they're saying, all right, I'm not going to invest in companies that have cluster munitions, firearms, very bad practices. And they say, I'm just not investing in certain sectors. And then those investors don't incorporate ESG into their valuation model necessarily. They're just screening it, yes or no. But more and more investors are looking at it on a holistic basis and integrating their thoughts and thinking about ESG as a part of how they value companies. And there, I think that companies like Lazard, like Norges, are using their thoughts on the sustainability of the business. So if they, ESG is about long-term sustainability and long-term growth of the business. If they think that the business is not well managed, they would take a valuation discount. If they think that the business is not prepared to survive over the long term because of climate change or certain risks, they might take a valuation discount or take a smaller position in the company than they would otherwise. So I do think it's important to not look at any one particular rating agency, but really explain to your investors and your potential investors how management thinks about risk, how management thinks about long-term growth, how management is managing the risks of the company, and what your approach is. It's not about specific numbers or what your carbon disclosure is. It's about, is this a well-managed company that's set up for the future? If the investors see information that makes them think that that's not the case, they're going to take a valuation discount.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. I think we really appreciate the presentation. I think there's a lot of information that you provided us. And, well, hope to see you next year with another survey.
I hope so, too. And I hope next year it's in person. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Rodrigo.
Thank you.